Mr. Ahmed has today talked about macro, fiscal and decentralization options to address marginality. And what is behind these words? And we would like to know from you if you can tell us a little bit about this, what it means.
Well, the macro puts the overall framework, the revenue conditions, the spending conditions, the debt, which all puts pressure on the public finances, central level, lower levels, and especially where services are provided for the poor. So the macro matters. Countries that have poor macroeconomic conditions have very little in the way of resources that can actually be provided for the poor. For example, many Latin American countries have tax GDP ratios of around 25 to 30% of GDP, including countries like Bolivia, which is 36% of GDP. Now, they try and provide for marginal people, the indigenous people particularly, living in the Altiplano by making sure that the transfers are equitably distributed. And there's some redistribution from the richer Europeans and living in the big farms and their estates, etc., in the lowlands to the poor people living in the Altiplano. But that depends on whether or not you have a tax system that can tax these rich people, redistribute towards the poor. But you know, if you have a country like Pakistan with a tax GDP ratio of 8% of GDP, scope of redistribution is somewhat limited, or especially when you're in the middle of a war and you have economic crises, huge defense expenditures, very little money left over for providing any public services whatsoever, which sometimes also then feeds the insecurity of the marginalized that then leads to political difficulties. So, you know, if you don't have the financing at the macro level and you don't address the needs of the marginalized, they go elsewhere. Sometimes the elsewhere is not very, very pleasant and can lead to unfortunate consequences. So it's the point is that it's an interrelated set of issues, and you can't just think of it in isolation. You know that you have a policy, another policy, and just focus on that and not on the overall picture. And I suppose the point I was trying to make is that it matters how, in what framework you put it in. It matters whether the monies are sufficient. It matters if you have the monies, the mechanisms you have for transmission are properly set up. Because you give money to local officials and they don't have the interests of the marginalized, however you define it, there's some discussion on marginality. If they don't have them in their preference function, they're not going to provide the money for them. And quite often the decentralization set up done around the world to meet poverty reduction standards haven't been properly designed. So there's an expectation that you implement buzzwords like decentralization that you'll be able to meet poverty reduction goals or meeting the needs of marginalized people. It doesn't happen that way.
But okay, you're talking about the government level. You're mentioning the 8% GDP in Pakistan, which is taxed. Is there then not a role for NGOs and private business to maybe fill, at least temporarily, the gap which is existing?
Yes and no. Of course there is always a gap for Gates Foundation and other donors, etc., to provide resources where there isn't sufficient in the way of resources. But it's a question of how you do it, because the mess has been created in Afghanistan with all sorts of different people doing different things. You set up thousands of accounts, each one of them has their own accounting framework, nobody knows where the money is going, there are no results. So you can have well-meaning donors quite often going in and making the matters worse. I suppose the other point I was making is that if you have incentives for greater informality being set up by these transfers, well-meaning transfers from the donor agencies that meet neither the objectives of the central government nor local governments, you can end up creating rent-seeking arrangements with very little to show for it on the ground. And that's what you've seen again in the Pakistan case. Lots of donors in there providing lots of money, it's nothing to show for it.
What does Pakistan need to?
It needs better governance. It needs to make sure that the needs of the people are better represented, and that the vested interests that have governed for the last 20, 30 years take a back seat. That's the reason why you have a tax GDP ratio of 8%, because these guys don't want to pay taxes. And nobody wants to help the poor.
Okay.
So that's an unfortunate
political will and redistribution of
but also better governance. I mean, complete redistribution also can kill growth. So you want growth and employment opportunities. So you don't want to kill the investment in the private sector. But at the same time, it has to be a private sector which is efficient. And not a private sector that depends on subsidies and aid.
It's a balance.
It's a balance, yes, that has to be properly managed.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for the interview. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.